remember growing up, church was not a voluntary association. It was a requirement when we did go. I was expected to sit through Mass quietly, following along to the best of my ability until it was time for us to go off to classes. In those classes, I was not free to choose what I learned. I was instructed on what to do, what to read, how to read it, and what I was expected to have learned. The idea of free conversation or exchange of ideas was not welcome, unless your ideas matched those of the catechism instructor. I remember that we had to dress up for church, and a lot of the times that required wearing a collared shirt or dress pants. We had to keep them nice because they had to last. It was not a terrible experience, but I don't recall it being particularly pleasant. God seemed like he was so far away. I heard words spoken by the priest, the blessing of the sacrament, and it didn't seem to involve me at all. Even after my confirmation, I was still very lost in the idea of my relationship with God. Eventually, church became something we only did on special occasions, like Easter or Christmas. It further enhanced my deep disconnect from the idea of the divine, my only connection being my prayers with the Virgin Mary as an in-between. When I was in middle school, I discovered theater. I realized that it was connection and community that I craved. It wasn't about the role that I was playing or the attention I received from it. It was about the genuine connection to others that really spoke to me and lifted me up in a time in my life when I really needed it. This was my first experience with what James Luther Adams calls voluntary association. It was also my first experience with the love of community. While studying in Germany, James Luther Adams had a moment that he called a conversion experience. He was visiting a friend, the German psychiatrist and philosopher Karl Jaspers, in his home in Heidelberg. The year was 1936. Adams asked him what he deemed to be the contemporary significance of liberal Christianity. Jaspers replied vehemently, "Religious liberalism has no significance. It has no costing commitment." Adams was taken aback by this. Jaspers then said, "If I were a young man of liberal preferences today, I would return to the most orthodox branch of my heritage." Jaspers was referring to the liberals who became German Christians, Nazis. The liberals of Germany allowed the Nazis to infiltrate the state universities, where they compelled professors to shift their teachings toward a more nationalistic viewpoint. They allowed Hitler to dissolve the trade unions. The Nazis persecuted the confessional seminary that Adams was attending, ordering them to disband. Adams was struck by what Jaspers said. He asked himself, if fascism should arise in the States, what in my past performance would constitute a pattern or a framework of resistance? Until this point, he'd only been engaged politically through voting and reading the newspaper. He had not, in his mind, adequately participated as a citizen. He concluded that voluntary association was a vital part of our commitment as citizens because it causes us to own our own civic responsibility. It makes us accountable. Upon his return, Adams made it part of his ministry to be more politically active, working vigorously with the independent voters of Illinois, championing progressive candidates, and leading voter registration drives. Now, as Americans, we thrive on our voluntary associations. Our left-wing Puritan ancestors were the first arguers for separation of church and state, saying that they wanted people to have the freedom to choose which church they belonged to. They also did not want the state to dictate religion. Over 400 years later, we as a nation are still having that same argument. The French political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville marveled at our ability to use the principle of association. We are a nation of joiners. whether it be a professional association, a political organization, bowling leagues, or a reading group. We have associations for libraries, hospitals, schools, neighborhoods, and yes, churches. We crave that sense of belonging, that community of like minds, in this itself that feeds our soul. Within churches, we have various committees: social justice, worship arts, green sanctuary, covenant groups. Membership in these associations is not compulsory. We choose whether or not we want to be a member of a given association. I myself am a member of several organizations and associations. I choose to be a member of the Guild of St. Marie, the American Civil Liberties Union, and of the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association. I believe that Jaspers is right about the obligation part of church. Going to church can feel like an obligation. There's no costing commitment. It doesn't cost us anything to be here, and the commitment can be limited to only Sunday mornings. I know a lot of friends who go to their traditional churches, Catholic, evangelical, etc., hear a hopeful message, sing a couple of rousing hymns, drop some money in the collection plate, and that's their spiritual commitment for the week. Others might throw in some Bible study at their home or at church in addition to their Sunday attendance. Their faith isn't active, it's passive, and that's a perfectly valid path. I'm also reminded of the thousands of thoughts and prayers and these messages that I witness on Facebook on a daily basis when there is a major disaster or social issue. People will change their profile pictures to filter the latest cause celeb. I'm guilty of doing this myself. They also share touching stories of families reunited, pets adopted or not, and even the occasional inspirational quote in the form of a meme. I call this phenomenon the lazy person's cyber church. Doesn't cost anything. The commitment is when you feel like it, and it makes you feel as if you're contributing to the world. Again, a perfectly valid path, if not a lonely one. Voluntary Association for Adams are organizations which we freely choose to belong to rather than those we are born into, such as our families, communities, or political state. In voluntary associations, Adams insisted, we gain the power to negotiate our internal feelings, our own internal feelings, with others. And we gain power as a group to negotiate changes in the non-voluntary associations that rule our lives. The church, he argued, is a voluntary association that attends to the psychological well-being of its members, as well as the organization and the course of their collective behavior for promoting social, political, and economic change in the wider world. At the beginning of my seminary career, I had to complete a career assessment. It was a battery of psychological tests, as well as time spent with a doctor with a psychiatrist to see if I was a fit for this type of work. I expected the doctor to tell me to stop with my reenactments and my theater work. It didn't seem serious to me, or at least serious enough for a minister to be doing. In fact, he actually told me the opposite. He encouraged me to continue with my outside activities because it fed a different part of my soul that ministry did and should not. Now, various sociologists and psychologists state that the positive psychological effects of being a member of a voluntary association increases our life satisfaction and decreases depression. It makes us feel good about ourselves and about our community. It deepens our own self-respect. It gives us ownership of an issue and makes us accountable for its success. If we fail, we have the support of the community that we worked with to soften the blow. Studies show that it is excellent for retirees to volunteer. 63% of older adults who do so simply live longer. Now, there are tons of voluntary associations that do good works. One such example, as I mentioned, was the American Civil Liberties Union, which uses the power of the courts regularly to champion for those whose rights have been violated. Their most recent wins are the court cases against the federal travel bans that would have limited travelers from specific Muslim countries coming into the US. I want to give you a few UU examples of this work. An unsung hero of our movement is Madame Carolyn Severance. She came from Boston to California for her husband Theodoric's health. She wanted to start a Unitarian church, so she did so in her living room. Eventually, she saw the need to help children be better prepared for school. So her ladies group that she formed petitioned the state and brought kindergarten to California. She also served as president of her city's Free Kindergarten Association. She also advocated tirelessly for women's suffrage, as well as immigrant rights and the rights of persons of color. There's actually a really interesting letter by her written to Susan B. Anthony where she chastises Susan B. Anthony for leaving behind women of color in the fight for suffrage. She was the first woman to cast her vote for president in the state of California in 1912. On February 21st in 1954, the Los Angeles congregation voted to refuse to sign a loyalty oath that the state of California had amended to the tax documents under the Levering Act, which made state recognition of nonprofit status contingent on making of an oath of allegiance to the United States. The oath required that the church would not advocate the overthrow of the government of the United States and of the state of California by force or violence or other unlawful means, nor advocate the support of a foreign government in the event of hostilities. The church leaders believed that the state's requirement to sign this oath under pressure of losing their tax-exempt status was a violation of the First Amendment guarantees of free speech and the separation of church and state. They crossed out the offending oath, returned the paperwork, resulting in the loss of the tax-exempt status of their church. The church then sued the County of Los Angeles to recover the property tax charges withheld. 4 years later, on June 30th, 1958, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of First Church, stating that the oath did violate the First Amendment. Friends of Orange County Detainees is a voluntary association of this church that works tirelessly for the rights of incarcerated immigrants, visiting them, offering them hope with transition, offering them, and often acting as legal representatives for them and advocates. One of the ladies I spoke to from FOCD is actually going back to get her certification in immigration law so she can be of further assistance. That's voluntary association at work. She saw a need and she's filling it. We choose to come to this church. We choose to join the Social Justice Committee, participate in the Worship Arts Committee, and we do so because we want to. We get to decide what issues are important. We get to wrestle with those issues as a group of people that, while we may not think alike, we can empathize with one another and offer solidarity. Our faith has a long history of not being passive, but active. We are a faith that calls for action. So we will often attend the Women's March, the Union Rally, the Science March, or the Immigration Solidarity event. We do these things as a result of our voluntary association. We are the faith of Martha and Waitzel Sharp, who helped endangered refugees escape Czechoslovakia and Vichy France during World War II. We are the faith of James Luther Adams, who was interrogated by the Gestapo for his involvement with that seminary and the underground church movement in the height of Nazi Germany. We are the faith that marched with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King on Selma. We are the faith that actively sided with love, fighting for the rights of LGBT persons to marry in this country. Why else would we choose to associate with this church? Why else would we choose to associate as Unitarian Universalists? Now I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that we choose to associate with church because of the love of God. Gasp! Did he just say we come to church for the love of God? No, not all of us do. What does he mean by that? Well, James Luther Adams said that we all live by our devotions. We live with our love of God. We place our confidence in something, whether it be human nature, reason, scientific method, church, nation, Bible, or God. Isn't that just playing with words? You might be asking yourself. The answer is yes, and if you choose to reject belief in God, you do so based on loyalty to a different truth or goodness that is valid and reliable. Adams said that the atheist rejects what appears to be sacred and independent for the theist, but in doing so, recognizes something else that is independent and even holy for him and her. The recognition of something independent appears in both the atheist and the theist. The one rejects the word God, the other accepts it, but both believe in something sacred and reliable. This is our common ground. Whatever title or word you use, it comes down to this: what is sacred, what is truly independent, and what is ultimately reliable. Adams was a Unitarian Christian, and he loved to preach from parables. One of his favorite parables was that of the prodigal son, which I read for the children today. It comes from Luke 15:11-17. In this story, the father has two sons. The younger son asks for his inheritance, and after wasting this fortune, the word prodigal means wastefully extravagant, he becomes destitute. He returns home with the intention of begging his father to be made one of his hired servants, expecting his relationship with the relationship with his father has likely been severed. The father welcomes him back and celebrates his return. The older son refuses to participate. The father reminds the older son that one day he will inherit everything, and they should still celebrate the return of the younger son because he was lost and now is found. What is sacred? What is independent? What is reliable? To the prodigal, the sacred is his father's forgiveness. What is independent is his faith, which he believes to be broken because he had sinned against his father. And what is reliable is his father's love. The elder brother, on the other hand, was the good son that stayed behind and never left the community of his father's love. He became a defender of law and morality, and his ethical principles, not readily accepting his brother's return, became sacred to him. Unfortunately, this made a community exclusive, and it's not what happens in reality. His ethics became unreliable, the law immutable, and he is left isolated from the community of his father's affections. Adams explained this with the love of God then is the giving of oneself to the power that holds the world together, and that, when we are tearing it apart, persuades us to come to ourselves and start new beginnings. It is not bound to achieve evil, and is not bound to achieve good. The prodigal escaped from one, and the elder brother was bound to the other. And why is this sort of love alone reliable? This love considers the diversity of individuals. It does not judge us based on whether we are perfect or not. It does not judge us on whether we follow the rules or not. It encourages a pattern and a framework of resistance. This love is inherent. It is holy and it is pure. It is a movement toward beloved community where we can channel that love to a world that is suffering, divided by race, class, sexuality, or gender. I believe that it is the reason that we are all here. I believe that it is the reason we choose to voluntarily associate as Unitarian Universalists. Blessed be, and may it be so.